The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I've been telling you for about a year now that we can expect over the 18 to 24 following months, now the sort of following 6 to 12 months, for ISIS to lose major territory in the Middle East, as well as many of their key people, making the more important question, how do you stop the impact of their radicalization ideology across the West? This is happening. ISIS has lost major territory in Syria and in Iraq. We now have early initial reports from Syrian state television that say that the leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was killed in an airstrike in Raqqa, Syria on Saturday night. And if you've been following the sort of movement of ISIS, Raqqa has been a sort of nerve center for ISIS, a headquarters of sorts for their activities, which also includes sex trafficking, as well as attacks in Syria, Iraq, elsewhere. ISIS controls all aspects of life in Raqqa. They've taken over the government, they control the schools, they've set up courts and police to enforce Sharia law. Some of their worst displays have taken place there, like public executions, public displays of bodies, and false claims of al-Baghdadi's death have been reported before, Pat. So we'll have to see what ultimately comes of this. There are skeptical independent experts, but at the same time, we're seeing more and more unified reporting about this killing. So this is important in terms of destabilizing ISIS organizationally in the first place. But we have to remember that if an individual in France is radicalized by the ideology of ISIS, the killing of this particular person, if true, is not going to change the ability of that individual in France to become radicalized.
Yeah, but it might take some time for our own U.S. government to confirm the fact that Baghdadi was killed, if he in fact was. But that's pretty standard. Mohammed Emwazi, who is colloquially known as Jihadi John, who was featured in those videos of beheadings of James Foley and others, he was killed in an airstrike in November of 2015, but the U.S. government didn't confirm that until the following month.
That long it took?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So we may have some time to wait. But the sort of key aspect here is that defeating ISIS isn't going to happen through just bombing their physical territory in the Middle East and killing leaders. And this is why it's so complex, because ISIS and jihadism and those who sympathize exist globally throughout the world, throughout the Muslim world. And that can include majority Muslim countries. It can include particular communities, enclaves in Western countries as well. And as we see each time we have one of these attacks in the UK, France, Belgium, the US, jihadists of this flavor are decentralized and worldwide are fulfilling what they see as their mission, whether they have direct connections to institutions or individuals in Syria and Iraq led by al-Baghdadi or not. The real objective has to be fighting radical Islamist ideology. And many people refer to these suicide attacks that we've been seeing as mindless acts or mindless killings. But they aren't really mindless. They're intentional, planned acts that are carried out with the purpose of killing those who are going against whatever the believed doctrine is of these individuals. And this is often by people who have been proven to be educated, and I guess you could say otherwise mentally sound. The whole mental illness thing is complex because on the one hand, how mentally sound can you be if you're willing to kill yourself and others on the basis that God likes it and you'll end up in heaven with 72 virgins? But the truth is that saying all of these perpetrators are merely insane is really an insult to people who deal with mental illness. Overwhelmingly, people who are, quote, mentally ill are not violent, period. So yes, there may be mental illness involved in some cases, but there is always more than that. And it's this radicalization, it's this reading or false reading or accurate but perverted reading, call it what you want, plausible reading of the scripture that they believe calls for this type of violence. So the problem isn't sort of fundamentalism. It's kind of a classic example if you think of the religion Jainism. Jainists are vegetarians whose entire lives revolve around not harming other living things. Extremism in a Jain is basically people staring at the ground when they walk so they don't step on bugs or kill bacteria, or drinking water through cheesecloth so you don't accidentally drink up or eat a bug, right? That's extremism in Jainism. Extremism per se doesn't directly lead to what we're seeing through these readings of the Hadith and the Quran. So that's where the focus, I think, needs to be.
No, it really is two parts. One part of that, of course, is if it's a fundamentalist approach, and then the other part is the ideology itself.
Yes.
And perhaps the problem is more severe when it comes to Islam because there hasn't been that enlightenment that Christianity has had. And of course, the key prophet in Christianity was seen as this peaceful hippie type guy, where you can't really say the same thing when it comes to Islam.
Yes, although there's been no shortage of people doing violence under Christianity as well. In the U.S., as we talk about, worldwide, most terror is committed by Muslims. In the United States, by and large, it is committed by white Christians, even if you call them so-called casual Christians. So killing radicals in Raqqa is not going to solve the problem. We have to commend and empower those within the Muslim community whose mission it is to moderate and modernize the religion, as well as ex-Muslims whose mission it is to support and protect other ex-Muslims. And the left has this horrible habit of demonizing inside reformers. I don't have to mention their names. You probably know who some of them are, because they see jihad as a political problem, not as a religious one. And they see attempts to reform and foster defection as a sort of attack on the Muslim community. And you really have to separate the two. So encourage Muslim communities to be more willing to communicate with law enforcement, encourage moderate interpretations of the Quran and the Hadiths. But we're never going to get anywhere unless we name the particular flavor of Islamist ideology that needs to be targeted. That's not Islamophobia. It is actually distinguishing radicals from reasonable Muslims. And I think that saying extremist Islam doesn't exist is a real problem. I think saying moderate Islam doesn't exist is also a problem, because whatever you can point to in the scriptures, you see it in Christianity. There is huge violence in the Bible, but you have moderate Christians just as you have radical Christians who are willing to commit terror under that umbrella. So we'll see if this is ultimately confirmed. Big news if it is, but not a panacea, no doubt about it. I want to talk a little bit about last week's James Comey hearings. What wasn't said in those hearings is just as important as what was said, and the meaning and the style of the non-answers from James Comey are both very relevant. 538 did a sort of compilation of what James Comey didn't answer during the testimony. Why are non-answers important? Well, it's about not ruling things out that would be way simpler for James Comey to just say didn't happen, no, and not saying no opens the door to possibly really serious things. And there's examples of how not answering something one way or the other is not always the same. If I say to NSA Director Admiral Mike Rogers during a hearing, Pat, is Joe Smith a covert operative? For Admiral Mike Rogers to say, I'm not going to speak one way or another about that, that makes sense. That is very different than saying, hey, were you ever asked by anyone at the White House to make false statements? I'm not going to comment about my conversations with people at the White House. That's a very different non-answer than outing a CIA operative, so to speak.
There's also that difference of no versus to the best of my knowledge, no.
Yes, and oftentimes the wordsmithing that exists is also relevant. So let's look at some of these items that James Comey refused to talk about, which are very, very relevant. This is, again, from 538's website. This is the communication between the Trump and Russia campaign. Comey refused to discuss whether there was a backdoor communication channel established between Donald Trump and Russia. That's relevant because there have been many allegations relating to and involving many Trump staffers and Jared Kushner's desire to establish this backdoor channel. Comey did not discuss whether there were more undisclosed meetings than the ones that have gone public. Common sense tells us yes, they were, because we continue hearing about more and more undisclosed meetings. James Comey did not discuss whether there were attempts to conceal or destroy evidence of communication between Donald Trump and Russia, very relevant to what is going on. James Comey also didn't discuss what he knows about that VEB Russian bank whose chief reportedly met with Jared Kushner during the transition. Okay, with regard to Michael Flynn, James Comey did not talk about during last week's hearing. He did not say whether Michael Flynn is a central figure. That is relevant because we know of so much that James Comey did. What about that Michael Flynn did? If Michael Flynn is not a central figure, it almost tells us more about how bad the situation is. Also from 538's assessment, when it comes to questions about Donald Trump, James Comey refused to talk about whether Donald Trump colluded with the Russians. Okay, that one we can sort of understand. But more interestingly, James Comey refused to talk about whether any of the criminal allegations in that now infamous blackmail dossier are true. Will we ever get answers to those questions? I'm not really sure. Some claiming, Pat, that we can't read anything into James Comey's non-answers. I don't agree with that. James Comey does not mince words. As we know, he has been clear, for example, that Donald Trump at two different moments was not personally under investigation. So I think that while we can't necessarily deduce anything specific from Comey's non-answers, Comey is a guy who speaks very clearly and forthrightly when he feels he can. I think this is very important.
Is it possible, though, that James Comey just wasn't willing to bring up a lot of the Trump-Russia collusion allegations because he didn't really think it was fitting given that special prosecutor Mueller has taken over in that regard?
Yes, that is a relevant question, right? Which is if Comey feels he's there to talk about A, he's just not going to talk about B. This is one of those cases where we have to look at if there's something that is potentially major, and James Comey could very easily just say, nothing there, folks, with a simple no answer. The fact that he chooses not to do that is not meaningless. And my advice to Democrats would be follow every lead through, let Mueller do his job, but simultaneously, because as we're starting to see, this could be a really long haul. This could go beyond the 2018 midterms. Progressives and Democrats have to build a platform for 2018. Watergate and Nixon, as you've pointed out, Pat, took a long time. This might lead to nothing. It might lead to something. But we're halfway to 2018 here. Progressives have got to get a platform together.
And we still did learn a lot from this James Comey testimony. Like, for example, he felt directed by Donald Trump to end the investigation into Michael Flynn.
Major.
And Comey called Donald Trump a liar on more than one occasion.
He said the whole context of why these memos exist that James Comey took contemporaneously after these meetings, it's because he said, unlike with all the other people I've worked with, I believe Donald Trump was at some point not going to tell the truth about this. That in and of itself is major. So send me your thoughts about the non-answers of James Comey. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show, and I'm sure that we will be following up about this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Bruce Mann. Bruce, thank you. Major thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. That is our #1 funding source. You can sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. If the normal rates are high for you, we have a discount code, I voted 17, all one word, all lowercase. You can also make a pledge of as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Those dollars are adding up. More than 1,500 of you now making a pledge at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. And if you ever shop on Amazon.com, remember to go to davidpakman.com/Amazon before you shop, because that will support our work with every single purchase that you make. In response to James Comey's testimony last week, President Donald Trump now says he is 100% willing to testify under oath. He is explicitly accusing the former FBI director, whom he fired, of just making up a ton of what he said in front of that Senate panel on Thursday morning. Let's go to Donald Trump at a Rose Garden press conference at the White House.
I want to get back to James Comey's testimony. You suggested he didn't tell the truth in everything he said. He did say under oath that you told him to let the Flynn, you said you hoped the Flynn investigation he could
I didn't say that.
So he lied about that.
Well, I didn't say that. I mean, I will tell you, I didn't say that.
And did he ask you to pledge his
And there'd be
loyalty?
nothing wrong if I did say it, according to everybody that I've read today, but I did not say that.
And did he ask for a pledge of loyalty from you? That's another thing he said.
No, he did not.
So he said those things under oath. Would you be willing to speak under oath to give your version of those events?
100%. I didn't say under oath. I hardly know the man. I'm not going to say, I want you to pledge allegiance. Who would do that? Who would ask a man to pledge allegiance under oath? I mean, think of it. I hardly know the man. It doesn't make sense. No, I didn't say that, and I didn't say the other.
So if Robert Mueller wanted to speak with you about that,
I would be glad to tell him exactly what I just told you, Joe.
And you seem to be hinting that there are recordings of those conversations.
I'm not hinting anything. I'll tell you about it over a very short period of time.
When is that?
Okay?
Yeah, more on that later. We have to apply Occam's razor here, right? Do you believe the guy who lies all the time, which would also sort of imply by definition that James Comey, a well-liked and highly respected public servant of decades career, made up not only his assertions, but created fake memos to spread the lies as well? Or do you just believe that Trump is lying, which he has done before? We really need to apply Occam's razor here.
Yeah, and of course, Comey's judgment has been called into question, but not so much the veracity of his claims, whereas Donald Trump, we know him to be a pathological liar.
Constantly. And the great thing here is that Trump is picking and choosing when Comey can be trusted and when he isn't, which is 100% Donald Trump's MO. If you agree with him, you're the best. If you disagree, you're absolutely the worst, fake news, whatever. In James Comey's case, he's sort of both, because Donald Trump also said at the White House Rose Garden, quote, "Yesterday showed no collusion, no obstruction, but we were very, very happy. And frankly, James Comey confirmed a lot of what I said, and some of the things that he said just weren't true." So we can trust James Comey's memo and testimony that he told Trump, you're not personally under investigation right now. Totally trustworthy, James Comey is on that issue. But the notes that Comey made right after that same meeting, now we can't trust those notes about the loyalty pledge. We can't trust those notes about the black cloud over my head, about the Russia investigation. We can trust James Comey's assertions that are good for Trump from that meeting, but not the same assertions from the same meeting that happened to not be good for Donald Trump.
We suspected that Donald Trump would be live tweeting the James Comey testimony. He didn't actually tweet until the day after.
Right.
But he was able to wrap up that cognitive dissonance all in one tweet together.
Stunning.
It's fascinating.
Absolutely fascinating. And by the way, this whole Trump is 100% willing to testify. He was 100% willing to release his tax returns as soon as XYZ happened. We're not getting those, Pat. I don't expect that we're going to see Trump testify under oath.
No, I mean, a sitting president has only testified to Congress while they were in office, of course, 3 times. Hasn't happened since Gerald Ford when he talked about his decision to pardon Richard Nixon.
Is that true?
I think under those circumstances, he's not going to go along with it.
All right. I did not know that it had happened. Do you know any of the other of the 3 times where it happened?
Abraham Lincoln and Woodrow Wilson.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, yeah, not likely to happen. But hey, at the same time, lots of things are happening under Trump that no one would have guessed were likely to happen. There have been obviously no shortage of Trump associates and appointees who have been tied to Russia. And the newest is, hope you're sitting down, Donald Trump's new pick for FBI director to replace James Comey. After all this controversy about the firing of James Comey over the investigation into Trump-Russia ties and Trump's personal lawyer in the Russia matter having Russian clients, and the hearings and the tweets and the testimony and the covfefe, Trump has now nominated a new FBI director who is himself connected to Russia. Last week, Donald Trump announced on Twitter at 7:44 a.m. in the morning Eastern Time that he will be nominating Christopher Wray as the new FBI director, tweeting, "I will be nominating Christopher A. Wray, a man of impeccable credentials, to be the new director of the FBI. Details to follow." Wray's law firm, King Spalding, represents, wait for it, 2 of Russia's largest state-controlled oil companies, Gazprom and the now infamous Rosneft. The Trump-Russia blackmail dossier claims that Rosneft's CEO Igor Sechin, offered Trump a 19% stake in the company in exchange for Trump lifting the oppressive sanctions on Russia. The dossier says that this deal was made between Sechin and Carter Page when Page was in Moscow in July of last year, as yet unproven. But here's something that's not just an allegation. Here's something that we know to be true. Rosneft started a $500 billion oil drilling partnership with Exxon in 2012, while Trump's Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was CEO of Exxon. There's no ifs, ands, or maybes with that. The venture happened to fall through when former President Obama, remember him, placed sanctions on Russia in 2014. So Rosneft has a number of excellent reasons to want Donald Trump in office and have the Russian sanctions lifted. We know that Trump moved quickly to try to start lifting those sanctions as soon as he took office. So the law firm of Trump's new FBI director appointee handles Rosneft's legal affairs, and the law firm would be in the middle of the negotiations between Rosneft and Exxon.
And remember, the first name that Donald Trump circulated when it comes to the replacement for the FBI director was Joe Lieberman, a guy who worked at the same law firm as Donald Trump's personal attorney,
That's
Mark
exactly
Kasowitz.
right. It is endless connections. And this would already be enough to be hugely concerning. But it doesn't stop there, because I mentioned that other company, Gazprom. They are also represented by Wray's law firm. And according to U.S. State Department documents leaked in 2010, as well as to testimony from former Ukrainian Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, Gazprom is deeply connected to the highest-ranking Russian crime boss in the world, Semyon Mogilevich, who allegedly oversees Gazprom subsidiary that moves oil from Russia to Ukraine. He's described by the FBI as the most dangerous mobster in the world, and half of that subsidiary is owned by Ukrainian oligarch Dmytro Firtash, a member of Vladimir Putin's inner circle. So what do we have here? Not only is Donald Trump's FBI director pick connected to Russia through his employer, he is connected to the Russian mob and Vladimir Putin through his employer. A lawyer, talk about a Freudian slip, not a liar necessarily, a lawyer who works for the firm representing Gazprom is being appointed to lead the U.S.'s highest crime-fighting bureau, which is conducting the U.S. Justice Department's investigation of potential ties between Trump and all of these people. Wray may have even less motivation than James Comey to get to the bottom of the Russia scandal. I really don't see, Pat, at this point, how anyone could be against a Trump-Russia investigation if you're still hostile to there being an investigation. Why? If this is all just a massive series of coincidences, that would be great, but an investigation could do no harm. And if your response is, but David, the DNC screwed Bernie. Yeah, the DNC screwed Bernie, and it has nothing to do with this right now.
And I remember Republicans saying after Donald Trump fired James Comey that, well, he's not really firing the entire FBI. The investigation will continue. But who's in position of power there really matters in terms of how aggressively you investigate.
Absolutely.
And so if he's going to pick this guy who seems to be just a hack in his corner, I mean, it's going to undermine the investigation, and the House investigation's been undermined as well. Yeah,
that investigation has been a joke. Just pick somebody who's not to get connected to Russia, Donnie boy. Earlier in the show, I talked to you about the tapes that may exist or may not exist. Here's Donald Trump addressing the existence of those tapes just the other day.
And you seem to be hinting that there are recordings of those conversations.
I'm not hinting anything. I'll tell you about it over a very short period of time. Okay? Okay. Do you have a question here?
When will you tell us about the recordings?
Over a fairly short period of time.
Are there tapes, sir?
Oh, you're going to be very disappointed when you hear the answer. Don't worry. John, do you have a question for the president?
Soon. It's been a long time since these tapes were first mentioned. The House Intel Committee has given Donald Trump until June 23rd to release the tapes, if they exist. This entire tapes thing might seem trivial, but it's not. Because either Donald Trump hinted at tapes that don't exist to intimidate James Comey, and he should come clean about that lie, and that is a type of intimidation, or there are tapes and they should be released so that we can hear what was said and what wasn't said in the meeting. It will clear up what Donald Trump says were lies from James Comey. Just give us the tapes and we'll listen to what he said.
And if that tweet was just intended to intimidate James Comey, it completely backfired because during the testimony, James Comey said, "Lordy, I hope there are tapes of the conversation."
That's exactly right. I mean, speaking among friends here, it's hard to believe that the tapes, if they exist, will be released and they will reveal that Comey's the liar. Comey spent the majority of his 30-plus year career in law enforcement, testified under oath in front of a Senate subcommittee in testimony that hundreds of millions of people will at least see clips or reports of, knowing that it's possible that there are tapes which could prove that he's lying if he chooses to lie. If anyone understands how bad it could be to lie in those circumstances, it would be James Comey, who would realize I could end up in prison and there's a possibility that there are tapes. I just don't think Comey was lying.
It's also pretty ludicrous how the White House is playing coy when it comes to if there are tapes or not.
Yeah.
They would be the ones to know, no one else.
They would be the ones who made the recordings. Do I believe there are tapes? I don't believe that there are tapes. I know that Trump has a history of recording people in the business world, but I believe that the tapes thing was to intimidate James Comey, which is actually worse than the recording of the meeting, which, by the way, would violate Washington, D.C. law. It's possible Trump recorded the meetings, but, you know, I would imagine that in New York is a one-party consent state for recording, meaning as long as one of the people being recorded knows there is a recording, it's legal. Washington, D.C. is a two-party consent state, meaning that both parties being recorded need to know about it or it's illegal. Now, you could say Donald Trump doesn't give a flying you-know-what about whether he's breaking the law or not. However, Trump is not technologically savvy, and you would imagine that if Trump asked for Oval Office meeting recordings, again, the phone system is another thing. If he's asking for the meetings to be recorded, I would imagine someone might say that is criminal. It violates the wiretapping laws. Don't do it. So my view is I don't believe that there are tapes here.
Well, just so you know, I am recording this in case your prediction goes sour.
Yes,
it's on the record now.
By all means, I'm okay with that. And yeah, Massachusetts, many states are two-party consent states, and it becomes complicated when you're calling from a one-party consent state to a two-party consent state. I believe federal wiretapping laws take precedence there, although not really relevant here. I don't believe there are tapes. I believe it was an intimidatory tactic, and I am very curious what Trump will ultimately tell us about this. And many people on our Reddit discussion forum are talking about this. I encourage you to join us there at davidpakman.com/Reddit.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Jeremy Lent, founder of the nonprofit Liology Institute and author of the new book, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. Jeremy, the timing of our interview couldn't be better because we recently interviewed Peter Joseph of the Zeitgeist Movement, whose new book deals quite a bit with this idea that the status quo of humanity on Earth is not some sort of obvious inevitability that could not have gone some other way, but really the result of the structures and systems that humans have put in place throughout civilization. And that's something your book deals quite a lot with, isn't it?
Yes, that is so true. And yeah, as you say, there's such a parallel there. Basically, the underlying theme of my book is that different cultures really create their own set of values. And those values they have are what have shaped history. And you know, the book goes all the way back from hunter-gatherer times to the present day and looks at how different cultural values have shaped history. But I think maybe the most important thing to take from that is that the values that we hold today in our culture, the values that we choose to live by, are going to shape our future.
And let's start maybe with, you mentioned hunter-gatherers. I mean, I've read quite a bit about the way in which we saw the agricultural revolution not only bring major advances for Homo sapiens, but also create new issues, right? Inequality in great part dates back to the starting to talk about our land. This is my plot of land. Hunger, disease, famine, etc. But sometimes some of those accounts sort of romanticize the hunter-gatherer era of humanity. Talk a little bit about that, because you discuss in the book that when humans were at the phase of being hunter-gatherers, it was not the panacea that we sometimes see it as.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And sometimes these debates, like the sort of the noble savage kind of thing versus, we need an institutional sort of organization because the life of humans by themselves is nasty, brutish, and short. Sometimes these debates get kind of polarized according to modern political viewpoints and lose a lot of, I think what's really interesting is the nuance below that. So in terms of hunter-gatherers, there is a lot we can learn actually from the way they organized their communities together. But there's also a lot we can learn from the imbalances that they created. So something that most people don't know is that it was actually while humans were hunter-gatherers tens or even hundreds of thousands of years ago that we actually created some of the greatest mass extinctions in all of the Earth's history. So, when humans first left Africa and went to Asia and then to Australia and then went across Siberia to the Americas, they just thought, wow, nature is so bountiful, all these big mammals out there. And of course, those mammals had no instinctive fear of humans, but humans had this power of be able to develop tools. So over a number of generations, they led to these mass extinctions. About 3/4 of what's called the megafauna of North and South America went extinct, and over 90% of Australia's megafauna went extinct. And I think the lesson we can learn from that is how humans can create these imbalances with the natural world, oftentimes without even being aware of it.
When you talk about imbalances, I mean, right now it's hard to avoid having a conversation about climate change. And in the book, of course, you're not arguing we shouldn't worry about climate change, but you do talk about how if we fix climate change, whatever form that solution ultimately takes, that humanity will create some new existential threat. Can you talk about why you feel so strongly about that?
Yes, and I do think that is so important for us to understand, because I think we need to recognize that climate change is really more of a symptom of what's wrong with our place in the world and our relationship with the natural world and relationship with ourselves, rather than a cause of something. So it's a little bit like the canary in the mine that is the early sign that there are some really deep imbalances. And I think if you just look at a deeper place, you see that our whole global system encourages us to consume at this growing rate. And everything about our values is based on this notion that consumption and growth in consumption is necessary for human flourishing. And I think the opposite, in fact, is true. And that right now we're on an accelerating course towards a precipice that is not just in relation to climate change, but in relation to the ways in which we are causing now our own sixth mass extinction of species. We're utilizing resources at a completely unsustainable rate, including things like fresh water, ocean fish, and leading to significant deforestation, desertification around the world. All these kind of issues are connected with each other. And if we try to just solve one issue alone, like climate change, what we're really doing is just kind of kicking the can down the road until a next bigger issue hits us.
So what needs to change more systemically?
Yeah, I think that what we need to do is shift some of the underlying values that lead us as a global civilization to this behavior of ever increasing consumption. Like it's as though, if you think of our world system like some kind of software, it's as though we keep getting bigger and bigger software glitches, and we keep trying to fix those glitches. But what we really need to do is look at the operating system underneath. And that operating system, in our current world view, our current way of finding meaning, has to do with things like consumerism and this desire for growth in possessions and for growth in status in terms of what we consume as being what leads to a sense of meaning in life, rather than other ways of finding meaning that are more sustainable.
Well, to take your software analogy, it seems if we tweak it slightly, it seems that the world approach to dealing with issues, calamities, is sort of that of creating a software patch which prevents the entire program from ceasing to function. But if you keep patching the same piece of outdated software, eventually it will no longer work with the hardware. And maybe there's something there to that analogy in terms of the human approach to solving problems. But at the same time, when you're talking about billions of humans dealing with complex interrelated problems, isn't it just from a practical level very difficult to get worldwide consensus on any problem?
Yes, I think it's very difficult to get worldwide consensus on any problem. And yet, what we've seen is there are moments in history when something like that has happened. So if you just think back a couple of hundred years ago, slavery was considered to be as essential to the sort of optimal working of the modern world at that time as global capitalism is considered now. But as a certain level of cultural evolution occurred, something shifted in the sense of what is right, where meaning arises and where morality arises. And so now, even though, of course, there are incidents still of slavery happening in the world, virtually everyone in the world agrees that that's a bad thing and that should be illegal. So there are these shifts that happen in spite of what seems to be like overwhelming odds. And to me, that is a source of hope, even as we look at some of the really quite terrifying directions we're going in right now.
Well, there are numerous futurists and scientists that believe we're at a sort of inflection point right now. So Ray Kurzweil, for example, when it comes to technological development, believes that we are in the middle of an inflection point, although it can be difficult to feel that when you're in the middle of it. Aubrey de Grey, who does research into longevity, believes that the first person who will live 1,000 years has already been born and that we are at a sort of accelerating point of longevity. Do you believe that, number one? And number two, what are the factors about life today that will impact where humanity goes?
Yes, and first, I do agree that we are at a major inflection point. The book looks all through the sweep of history, and we've seen two major transformations in the human experience, really, from when we were first hunter-gatherers. The first of those was with the rise of agriculture about 10 to 12,000 years ago. And the second of those was with the scientific and industrial revolution that occurred just a few hundred years ago, and we're still experiencing the impact of that now. And I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that this century we are going to be experiencing the third great transformation of humanity. And in fact, my last chapter is actually called Trajectories to Our Future, and it looks at some of these trajectories. It looks at one, which is this kind of Raymond Kurzweil kind of idea of what's known as a singularity, where technology and convergent technologies all lead to such a drastic change that the whole meaning of being human is changed forever. It also looks at the possibility of collapse of our civilization. And it looks at this third possibility of a possible sustainable flourishing for humanity. And so one of the things I do think we need to be very aware of is when we're looking at some of these high-tech, optimistic views of the 1,000-year person who's already been born, or what we can do with neural interfaces to the internet or whatever.
Sure.
I get so afraid that these people oftentimes are just focusing on the elite within the whole human race, of 7.5 billion of us, as the people who will get the benefits of that. So there's a scenario that I call techno-splits, where basically the people who are currently the elite in the world, maybe the wealthiest 500 million or so, get to enjoy genetic enhancement, neural interfaces, and maybe do get to live for hundreds of years or whatever. But meanwhile, billions of other human beings are suffering essentially a collapse from climate change and all these other environmental disasters that are hitting us. I think that's a very important issue for us to be aware of whenever we hear some of these kind of hopeful, optimistic scenarios, because if you're like me, your sense of being a human being is not just being this individual rejecting our sense of connection with others, but there's a really powerful sense of us being a human family. And we need to be really focused on the idea that technological advance is there for all of humanity, not just for an elite few.
Well, the book is fascinating. It's called The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. We've been speaking with the book's author, Jeremy Lent. Jeremy, thank you so much for talking to me about this today.
Yeah, thank you very much, David.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
During his presidency, we know that Donald Trump has been sort of hesitant to put himself in situations where there might be protesters or people making fun of him. He was a no-show at the White House Correspondents' Dinner in April, where there was a comedian making jokes about him. During his visit to Israel last month, he bailed on a speech in front of the national legislature because he was afraid that Israeli lawmakers might heckle him. It's been clear that the people of the United Kingdom are also largely not fans of Donald Trump, and that if he were to visit, there would be major protests in opposition to his policies and just his presence in the UK. For a while, the White House has been floating the idea of planning a trip for Trump to go visit London. A week after Trump's inauguration, British Prime Minister Theresa May visited the White House, invited Donald Trump to come to the UK, and publicly said shortly thereafter that Donald Trump had indeed accepted her invitation. But we have now learned from a British official that sometime in the past few weeks, Donald Trump called Theresa May and said, "I am not going until I know that there will not be massive protests in response." Is there any bigger special snowflake, to use a term that the right uses as a pejorative, of so-called social justice warriors, than Donald Trump demanding a safe space before he visits the UK?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy, too, because the UK is a relatively conservative country in Europe. Of course, they just voted to leave the European Union a year ago. They have a plurality of conservatives in their parliament. Theresa May is prime minister. I mean, it's not like he's going to Norway or Sweden.
No doubt. I mean, if you're talking about where Trump can go, we'll get to that in a second, because it's not a great list for him. Trump is scared by protesters. If Donald Trump thinks that a trip to the UK is due diplomatically, he should make the trip. He's the president of the United States, and he's afraid of protests. But again, we're not dealing with a normal world leader here. We're dealing with a president who is unprecedentedly thin-skinned and narcissistic. His ego just can't handle it. He has to stay in a safe space so he doesn't get triggered by protesters and bad press. And this is bewildering for a number of reasons, including that Britain is one of our closest allies. Something like this shouldn't hold him back. But number two, if he's going to wait until the British people are ready to have him and are supportive, it's just not going to happen. The things that have made Trump unpopular around the world are part of who he is. It's not going to blow over. The British people don't like the guy because of his politics, and his politics aren't going to change.
They also had a petition with over 600,000 signatures to ban him from the UK while he was running for president.
Yeah.
And that was over his proposal for a Muslim ban, of course, which they interpreted as hate speech. So for him to be given the red carpet in meeting with all these state leaders, the people aren't going to like that.
I support this in principle, actually. I wish Trump would apply it to the U.S. Only go places in the U.S. where you're liked, which means he really shouldn't be in Washington, D.C., if you look at how D.C. voted. One of the only places where Trump would even be close to considered popular, and it's still pretty bad, would be Russia, by the way. Near the end of the 2016 presidential election, Gallup conducted a poll in 45 countries that covered 75% of the world's population, and it found that Russia had the only population with a more favorable view of Trump than Clinton, but it was still a pretty small percentage of people. Only 33% of Russians wanted Donald Trump to be president. And the truth is, Trump is so unpopular that this idea of not going places that will protest will limit Trump's travel plans. He'll basically have to go places where protesting is banned or punished, right? So he could go to Russia, he could go to Saudi Arabia, Turkey is harsh on protesters. North Korea would be a good spot, even though North Korea doesn't like Trump. At least protesting is banned. It is hilarious that Donald Trump is saying, only when they're going to be polite to me am I going to go.
Yeah, and even if he was super popular in that country, you can still find a group of people who would protest him anyway, because in a country of millions of people, you're going to have those protesters. But yeah, I think in any number, he's just not going to be up for it.
It's just so pathetic. And this is the guy who says we're not going to be politically correct and we're going to say what's on our minds and blah, blah, blah. And protesters holding signs despite multiple countries with endless police and security people protecting him. He still doesn't want to go. It's absolutely pathetic. The James Comey hearing and everything that's going on with the Russia scandal is obviously important. It's news. It must be covered. But we cannot let it distract us from what is going on in our Republican-controlled House of Representatives. Thursday, the same day as the Comey hearing, the House passed the Financial Choice Act. This is a major effort to destroy financial regulation in the U.S., including much of what's contained in the Dodd-Frank Act. This hasn't yet passed the Senate. It may not. Some of the things that Republicans are doing in the House will pass the Senate, and very little attention is being paid to it. We've talked about this, Pat. Because it is scandal after scandal for Trump, people get distracted, media gets distracted, and we just don't hear about the stuff that Republicans are doing, and we've got to report on it.
And I think regardless, Republicans would be able to do it anyway because they have the votes, but what they're able to get away with is not face any political repercussions.
That's right.
Because they don't have to do it in front of the court of public opinion.
No doubt about it, and deal with the constituent calls and deal with everything we're seeing in terms of net neutrality and FCC complaints. So this bill would make major cuts to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That's a watchdog that is there to prevent lending abuses. Remember, the 2008 financial crisis was in great part connected to bad lending practices. This bill that was passed in the House by Republicans would diminish many of the requirements set up by the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Act, as well as the Consumer Protection Act. It would get rid of the Volcker rule, which inhibits banks' abilities to make hazardous wagers on Wall Street using taxpayer money. It would do away with the fiduciary rule, which requires brokers to act in the best interests of their retirement fund customers. This is a disaster, and the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, is calling this bill the crown jewel of Republicans' mission to deregulate Wall Street. I hope, Pat, that this doesn't pass the Senate. If it passes the Senate, it will probably have to have significant concessions made. But Republicans are running rampant in the House right now.
Also, Dodd-Frank was milquetoast to begin with. It was the one piece of substantial regulation we were able to get out of the Great Recession. So for that to be completely undermined, I mean, that's rough.
And this is like when we had 90% approval for universal background checks after a massive mass shooting in Sandy Hook, which led to countless deaths. And you still couldn't get it passed with President Obama in the White House. It is absolutely pathetic. Republicans love it. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said last month, quote, "I'd love to do something about Dodd-Frank, particularly with regard to community banks, but that would require Democratic involvement. I'm not optimistic." This is why Democrats need a platform, like I implored last week. It's important to be anti-Trump, but progressives need a platform. I think it's a good idea to focus on values insofar as healthcare for everybody, focus on values and patriotism when it comes to the environment and not destroying the planet. And really what I mean by destroying the planet is humanity, right? I mean, the planet will survive, maybe less able to support human life as we know it, but you can't just say we are the alternative to Trumpism or we're opposed to what Trump is, especially if Trump ends up going away and the Republicans are emboldened and are more able to do this stuff. So we really need people that inspire us, who we can rally around. It's not going to be Chuck Schumer. It's probably going to be someone more like Bernie Sanders and what Elizabeth Warren and Barack Obama were supposed to be, even though we've had questions recently about some aspects of what's going on with Elizabeth Warren. you've got to pay attention to what's going on in the House because it is an absolute disaster, Pat.
And we hear so much about how America is a center-right country. That's not the case when you go issue by issue. It's just a matter of messaging. And if Democrats are able to focus on a few key issues like healthcare, like the economy, they can win in 2018.
And legislatively, this is a center-right country, partially because of gerrymandering, but not when it comes to where people are on the issues. Voicemail number 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a voicemail I received. Take a listen to this.
Hi, David. Nancy in Oregon. Thank you for your wonderful piece on the alt-right. Unfortunately, you won't reach the undereducated alt-right with that wonderful message, but at least we can enjoy it. And thanks again. Bye.
Preaching to the choir. It's often a problem, but if you look at our YouTube comments, Pat, we're reaching some people who aren't already in the choir.
And I think you've got to thank segment producer Noah Ferguson for that alt-right piece.
Great piece on the alt-right, researched and edited by segment producer Noah Ferguson. All right, I'm out of time. No time to tell you what's on the bonus show, but it's a good one. DavidPakman.com/membership to sign up. Sign up right now, and you will have access in 30 seconds to the world-famous bonus show. We will speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.